The gospel lesson continues from the gospel according to St. Luke, the 14th chapter, the 1st and the 7th through the 14th verses. Luke tells the story of Jesus sharing a parable about a dinner party, about the kind of party that Jesus would plan were he to plan one. Listen carefully to these words from Luke's gospel. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. And when he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place," and then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up to the higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, in case they invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." This is the word of the Lord. Amen. Sounds like a great party, huh? Instead of all the cool folks, the ones that we like to watch late at night on entertainment tonight, we're being told to invite the poor, the lame, the crippled, the blind. And then when we get to the party, not only are we not to sit in the good seats, we're to sit in the lowest seats at the banquet, so that someone else might be in the better seats above us. These are not the people we would usually invite, even if it is the hospitable thing to do. Hospitality. The author of the book of Hebrews tells us to practice it with strangers, those that we don't know, those that we have no idea about. And for many of us, that's tough. It's a lot easier to be hospitable with those that we know, those we love, those we like running around with because they're like us. They like the things we like to do. They share the thoughts we like to share. It's easy to be hospitable with those that are like us. And let's be honest, often we are hospitable because we know that we're returning the favor of someone else's hospitality to us. We do the kindnesses that we do because when we were in need of kindness ourselves, someone showed up and shared hospitality with us. And so we're repaying what was done. It's payback time. Time to even the score so that we won't be indebted to anyone, so that we won't owe anyone. And so often we are kind because someone was kind to us. That's not a bad thing, perhaps, but today's texts are encouraging us to show hospitality simply because the opportunity presents itself, and not because there's any thought in our mind about someone paying us back for the hospitality that we're going to share. We're simply moved by compassion to act, and we share that hospitality with strangers without a thought that it might ever be returned. In other words, we act out of the purest motives to help someone else, whether we know them or not. You know, the kinds of folks that Jesus is talking about in this passage are in reality the leftovers of society in his day. They are folk unable to sustain a living on their own. They are dependent. They are completely and totally dependent upon the kindness of others. There are no social programs to care for them. There is no tax base that offers them help. They are totally, completely, utterly dependent upon the kindness of others for their very survival. I was hungry, you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was naked and you clothed me. Or did we pass by on the other side of the road? It occurs to me that when Jesus asked that question, that really perhaps he's referring to himself. Sure, I understand that question, I was hungry, did you feed me? I was naked, did you clothe me? I was thirsty, did you give me drink? Is asked in a broader sense, but Jesus is speaking also of himself. Think about it for a minute. What did Jesus do for a living? We know that he was a carpenter's apprentice to his father, right? He learned carpentry from his dad. Do we have any record that he ever built a thing? Do we have any record that he worked for wages? Anywhere at all? We don't have any record of Jesus building a thing. When he begins his ministry, the Gospels tell his story. There is never any mention of how he lived, how he survived day by day. And I think it's safe to assume that he did not get rich on Palestinians' extreme makeover. Carpentry did not provide him a living. Jesus understands the heart of a beggar. He understands what it is like to be dependent upon the kindness of strangers, because that's how he survived. He was dependent on others for food and for shelter and for clothing, and so were his disciples. When he called them into ministry, they were tax collectors, they were fishermen, but when he called them into ministry, they began to traipse around with him and to follow him wherever he went, and they were just as dependent upon those about them as any beggar in the crowd. Dare I say it, Jesus and his merry band of men were beggars. They lived off the kindness of others. They never throw a party in their own homes because they haven't homes. It's never their table that they sit around. It's someone else's that they go to. It's never out of their own wells that they dip a cup of cool water. It's someone else's well. They are dependent on the hospitality of others and on their gracious invitations to join for food and for sustenance and for life. They speak of what they know. And they know well the rejection that comes from being dependent on the kindnesses of others. That's a hard idea for us to accept, I think, that Jesus was dependent upon others. We live in a culture that values independence and shuns the idea of being dependent on others. We live in a culture that values us not owing anything to anyone. We like self-made men and lives lived without indebtedness. That's what we value. We honor those who can stand alone in the world and don't need the rest of us to get by. And yet I think Jesus lived quite the opposite. You know, hardly a week goes by here at the church. In fact, I would venture to say a week does not go by here at the church where someone does not come into the office and ask for some help of some kind or another. Maybe they're hungry and they need food, or they're out of gas and they're job hunting and they need gas for their car so that they can go to their next interview. Sometimes they come when the rent is due, or they come because their utilities have been cut off and the weather's turning cold and they have children and they don't know how on earth they're going to heat the house.